Welcome. My name is Glenn Diesen. I'm a professor at the University of Southeastern Norway, and with me today is the excellent Alexander Mercouris, and last but not least, Professor Richard Sakwa. So, Professor Sakwa is a professor of Russian and European politics at Kent University in the United Kingdom, and you should also be considered one of the leading, if not the leading, European scholar on Russia. So you published a huge amount of some of the best books on Russia since the 1980s. I honestly have lost count. It's 15, 16, I'm not sure. It's quite a few books now. And some of the more recent ones are Frontline Ukraine, which is Crisis in Borderland. For anyone who's watching, I have my own copy, obviously, and I would recommend everyone else to get a copy as well. I think it's just $15 or $20 on Amazon. But also the most recent book is Deception, Russiagate and the New Cold War. So all excellent books. So yes, Richard, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
So I thought before we delve into the war in Ukraine, perhaps we could explore some of the background. Again, this is one of the things that really surprised me in the media these days. There's no discussion about how we ended up here or how to get out of this trouble. So how did the West and actually Russia end up in this situation? I mean, there was a lot of optimism after the Cold War, especially surrounding the European project. And after the Second World War, you had France and Germany being brought together, making war unimaginable. And many of us, especially me, dreamed of that Russia would be similarly included and embraced after the Cold War to develop some kind of a unified, peaceful Europe without dividing lines. And seemingly, Moscow was fully committed to developing this, greater Europe based on Gorbachev's common European home. Yet this never happened, and now not only are we back in a Cold War, but we actually have a hot war, a horrific war in the middle of Europe. So maybe it's a too wide question, but what happened? What went wrong?
Can I just sort of maybe set the big picture in the context of your question? You're absolutely right. In fact, this is the issue I'm working on, a book called The Lost Peace, How We Messed Up the Post-Cold War Order. It's absolutely a crucial question. But let me just very briefly outline some sort of conceptual framework in which we can begin to understand what was going on. And the way I now see it is that after 1945, we saw the establishment, the creation of what I nowadays call a political West. Political West, US-led, its major agencies, NATO, European Union in a different sort of way, and of course a type of liberal economic order. So this is a political West. Can I just distinguish that? This political West was established and shaped by the First Cold War. There's also, one should be aware, two more, in my view, just for analytical purposes, two more Wests. There is the civilizational West, which has been developing for 500 years. This is the West of imperialism, but also of the Renaissance, of the Enlightenment, of the huge development of accountable government, and so on. This is the civilizational West, which Russia still has a complex relationship with since Peter the Great modernization, that vision of modernity. And I just say the third West, the cultural West, which goes back to Greece, even Egypt, and so on. So, but of which that cultural West, Russia is a member of the cultural West by definition, it doesn't need to be invited. We're talking about great works of art, music, etc. So the issue is, why did the relationship between Russia and the political West after 1989 turn out to be a failure? Because this political West, by definition, was the Cold War West. And because of the failure to transcend those elements of the Cold War, NATO enlargement, all of that element, and including a inability of the European Union in security and foreign policy terms to expand or redefine that political West. I wouldn't want to say they repudiated it. We then end up where we are. And so that is the relationship. And so then, of course, you could follow the detail of why the political West. But the fact is, because the political West did not fundamentally change after the end of the Cold War, it then reproduced the logic of Cold War, which took us into the second Cold War from 2014 and to what is, in my view, the foothills of World War II, even some people would argue today.
I completely agree. And I'm going to just add a further thing to this, which is, of course, we must also look at the way in which the Cold War ended, because I think there is a fundamental conceptual difference. Because, of course, the Russians, back at the end of the Cold War, this is before the fall of the Soviet Union, this is something that was building up a long time already. Gorbachev, in effect, expressed it. They were seeking peace. They were seeking peace in Europe. They were looking at themselves as part of a process that was going to establish what Gorbachev was referring to as a new thinking that was going to establish a peace in Europe, and a peace in Europe of which Russia was to be a part. The Cold War Europe, and one has to also say specifically the United States, by contrast, when the Cold War ended, didn't see it in terms of peace, they saw it in terms of victory. And I think that created a fundamental conceptual difference that has never to this day been overcome. Part of the anger that you see in so much of the political West is because they feel that the Russians have not accepted their defeat in the Cold War. And of course, part of the exasperation on the Russian side is because they feel that the West has treated them as a defeated party, as a loser, when they never felt themselves back in the 1980s as losers in that kind of a way. So this has added, on top of what Richard was saying, a degree of, shall we say, tension and emotional anger and visceral anger, which I think is very, very strong.
Can I just add to that? You're absolutely right. It is a foundational moment at the end of the Cold War, which means that, we've had this 30 years of the way that there wasn't an adequate post-Cold War peace settlement, which was inclusive, indivisible security, and so on. And we just a few months ago, Gorbachev, Mikhail Sergeyevich, died, as we know. And what was interesting in all the obituaries at that time, how little they stressed that his vision, as exactly as Alexander just said, his vision of the post-Cold War was not simply a Soviet capitulation. It was a sense, an appeal, more substantively, an appeal to the what I call, well, others as well, of course, the Charter International System, the United Nations-based system. So his famous speech in December 1988, when it effectively put an end to the Cold War, wasn't accidental because it was his United Nations speech. So the Soviet Union at the end, and of course Yeltsin afterwards, and Putin appealed to the autonomous international system, international law, the regulations based on all those norms, and indeed huge responsibilities based on the UN Charter, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is what Gorbachev was appealing to. He was not appealing or capitulating to that political West, which we just talked about. So there's a fundamental categorical mistake has been made right from the very beginning about what sort of peace Moscow was looking for. And indeed, I just want to say, is precisely on that basis that the relationship with China, India, and many other countries we saw at the Bali meeting of the G20 just a few weeks ago, in which it was absolutely clear that the G20 were refusing to accept the dominance of the G7 within them. And so, in other words, we're talking about over three decades of this theme between an autonomous with sovereign democratic internationalism on the one side and a US-led vision of a particular US-led type of liberal order on the other side. Many good things, of course, in that as well, but it's that element of dominance which Russia, China, India simply cannot accept.
I often ask my students, when did the Cold War end? Because, possibly the most significant era of the former century, and usually there's no consensus. And again, if it ended in 1989 or 1991, this is quite unique, because if you recognize that it's ended in 1991 when Bush and Gorbachev, they declared the Cold War to be over in Malta, then obviously what happened after with NATO expanding was a betrayal of that peace, which was organized under the Charter of Paris for New Europe. However, if you that's kind of the view the Russians take, that we had negotiated an end, we're going to have a common order. However, if you believe that the Cold War ended in 91 through victory, then the revisionist is not NATO. Then the revisionist is Russia for trying to undo this defeat by trying to claim to have a greater say and then undermine this U.S.-led order. So it's kind of interesting, which side is the revisionist? You really have to. It's hard to answer that question if you don't if we have no agreement on when the Cold War actually ended. It should be a central theme, I thought.
Can I build on that? Is that if this word revisionism is interesting, and you're absolutely right, it's not quite clear who is revisionist at this moment. But concerning Moscow and Russia's position, there is a complexity here, because in terms of commitment, rhetorical if not in substance, to the Charter international system, to the norms of the United Nations, etc., Russia is, like China and other countries in the G20, is far from revisionist. It's a status quo conservative power. But in terms of the second level of international politics, an international politics today dominated by the political West and its particular agenda, well, Russia is a revisionist power because it's not accepting the hegemony or the dominance of that political West. And of course, its revisionism today takes the form of an increasingly articulated political East, which includes obviously China, but also many other countries, and of course, a lot of sympathy in the global South, as we saw in Bali and other meetings of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, BRICS, and so on.
I would add to that. I think one of the interesting things about this crisis, this particular crisis that we're seeing at the moment, is that I think that the Western powers have been baffled by the extent to which the global South, not just the global South, I mean, big countries like China and India, which I don't think we should classify exactly with the rest of the global South, but the rest of the world is not sharing the Western perspective of this crisis, because the rest of the world doesn't accept the idea that it is the Western powers who are the status quo conservative powers. They see, on the contrary, the Western powers as ultimately the disruptive force in the international system, because of the way in which the Western powers are pressing them all the time. And I had a very interesting series of letters a couple of weeks ago. I mentioned the fact that I'd heard stories about how when United Nations, General Assembly things come, that the United States tries to strong arm countries to vote some ways. And I said I didn't, know the extent to which this is true. And I got a flood of letters from people across the global South, journalists, ex-ambassadors. They told me that is exactly what happens. And of course, it can be very effective, but it is building up enormous resentments at the same time. It is making people very, very angry. And behind sometimes these votes which take place, there is always that sense of anger as well, which I think people in the West perhaps are not aware of.
Yeah, that's exactly one of those issues of the post-Cold War years, is that this so-called, rules-based order, the liberal international order, in certain terms, claims the privileges which should properly belong to the United Nations in a more neutral, autonomous manner. So in a sense, it's a type of attempted usurpation. And we see it not just in the way we see in these votes and this strong arming, which of course goes all the way back to the Iraq War, when there was huge pressure for people to vote for that in 2003. Mexico in particular was under huge pressure at that time. But what we then see is an attempt to defend this autonomy of the UN system and of its agencies. And we see this in particular in the selection of the chairs of the UN specialized agencies. And at the moment, I think China is the chair for 4 of them, but each one was a huge battle. And of course, Russia was banned from the chair a long time ago, and even membership in some ways. But even the way that this is now conducted, effectively the political West, and of course, we can talk in a minute about the divisions within the political West, which we should do in Europe and the US. But nevertheless, these battles are just another example of what Alexander has just referred to.
This goes back to the revisionist question, because we in the West, we argue that Russia's revisionist because they're contesting this rules-based international order. But from the Russian perspective, and indeed much of the world outside NATO, it's the effort to advance this rules-based international order and replace it, will replace international law with this rules-based order, which is the revisionist aspect. So there's this key terms which often are used, largely uncontested, and I think that creates a lot of the problem. But how do you see this conflict over these different visions, as you said, about Europe? How did that end up or manifest itself in this crisis in Ukraine?
I'm going to make an observation based on, which again draws very much on what Richard said, because of course Richard talks about the political West, which emerged after the Cold War.
During the Cold War.
During the Cold War. And of course, the point is, this is a very recent development. I mean, we're talking about European history. The cultural West and the civilizational West have enormous historical antecedents. I mean, one going back to antiquity, another going back perhaps to the sort of early Middle Ages or whatever. But this new political West is a relatively modern, in some ways very artificial construct, constructed during a period of particular international tension that emerged after the Second World War, during the Cold War. And I think that this is one of the fundamental problems, because it is trying to perpetuate a structure that was created in a particular point in time, which is in some ways a very artificial structure. Because if you look at Europe, if you look at its history, Europe has not worked like that in the past. And the Russians, I think, conceived of themselves very much. Someone like Gorbachev had conceived of Russia as being essentially a European country, a part of both the cultural and the civilizational Europe. And finding themselves excluded from this, I think, has been one of the major factors in turning Russians, or at least a part of the political class in Russia, against the whole idea of Europe altogether. And this is creating tensions and problems in Europe itself, which we've seen express themselves partly in this particular war.
Absolutely. I mean, that's exactly the situation. It also, the perpetuation of this political West, which took shape in the post-war years and then perpetuated itself, leads to a number of conclusions and blockages, if I may put it this way. One of them is precisely after the end of the Cold War, certainly Gorbachev and others believed in what was, for shorthand, a common European home, which was a pan-continental vision, that after the end of this overlay of the Cold War, both blocs would enter Warsaw Pact, NATO, and they would then actually have the European Union, to use a modern name, the European Union would do what it was good at, which is peace and reconciliation between France and Germany. And the big challenge was to do, finally, between the western part of the continent and Moscow and Russia. But ultimately, it failed in a most spectacular manner to do it because of the perpetuation of this political West, which is an Atlantic West. An Atlantic West may have many good things to it, but it ultimately meant that Washington was in the basically, in terms of security and foreign policy, defense policy, in the driving seat. And it quite explicitly tried to block this sort of neo-Gaullist and Mitterrandist vision of pan-continental unity. Of course, it was strong in Germany, but that tendency, the Ostpolitik, the tendency was constantly under attack. For years and years, of course, their energy relationship was under attack from Washington. So the failure to achieve this pan-continental vision. More than that, it was absolutely quite explicit. At the end of the Cold War, we had Gorbachev's Common European Home. Putin termed it Greater Europe, Большая Европа. So it was there in a background, but it was then explicitly countered by this vision of Europe whole and free, which is obviously another excellent idea, but it was very explicit. This was going to be an Atlanticist Europe. Again, plenty of good things. And just one other word on NATO for this, that ultimately even NATO enlargement wasn't in and of itself a substance. Even such a partisan advocate of NATO enlargement like Zbigniew Brzezinski, in his famous 1997 book, The Grand Chessboard, he actually explicitly in that book, if you go back to it, which I'd forgotten, he actually explicitly said, of course, NATO enlargement must be accompanied by the creation of an overarching security body with Russia as a core member to mitigate the danger, because NATO enlargement in and of itself could be good. It stops the conflicts between the smaller nations, between Greece and Turkey, those endless border disputes, Hungary, Romania, Slovakia, and so on. So in and of itself, but it needed to be within that larger framework, which incidentally is something also advocated by William Burns, who used to be the US ambassador to Moscow, and of course warned against NATO enlargement in his cables back to Washington, and of course who's now head of the CIA. So at least we can be confident, at least there's somebody in the US establishment who understands Russian concerns, if not shows no great sympathy for them, but certainly understands them.
This was also at the heart of the President Medvedev's proposal for a new European security architecture in 2008, because he made the point that NATO can continue to exist within, but we should have this overarching new security architecture for Europe, which can accommodate, for example, well, not for example, but accommodate NATO. But the general idea would be then to mitigate some of the zero-sum aspects of the European security architecture. Because again, the main challenge, it seems, would have been, if NATO is the only or the dominant security institution in Europe, then expanding NATO essentially means that we have abandoned our objective of removing dividing lines, and instead we're now just moving the dividing lines eastwards, and well, quite predictably, you would have a new Cold War over where should these new dividing lines be drawn. And it is quite difficult, again, in this so-called shared neighborhood, because if you look at countries like Moldova, Georgia, Ukraine, opinions have obviously shifted now during this war, but these are quite divided societies internally, which would only be exacerbated, I guess, if they are pulled in different directions. So.
Absolutely. And if you look in Moldova at the moment, there's protests every day. The divisions are still there. I think they are in Georgia too. I get sort of stories from Georgia. So I think that this exists. And of course, expanding NATO East has not just created problems between Russia and the West, it's created problems within these societies themselves. We overlook the extent to which, for example, the conflict in Ukraine at least began as a civil conflict within Ukraine, to a great extent driven by NATO expansion, to a great extent driven by a particular vision of EU expansion in Ukraine as well. And the way in which particular factions in these countries have attached themselves to the idea of NATO expansion, for example, or EU membership, as a way of asserting their own particular ideas, set of ideas, partly against the Russians, but also against other political rivals and political factions within these countries. So, in fact, this process of NATO and EU expansion, the way it's happened, has actually created divisions, not just between the great powers, between the West and the Russians, but within societies in Eastern Europe as well. And of course, it's all been done with incredibly little debate, very little discussion, going back to the points that you were both making at the start of the program, it's very difficult to discuss the origins of these affairs, because of course if we do, then of course one senses that a lot of people would be worried that the book would open, people would then start going back, looking at the various mistakes we in the West made, and the responsibility would be broadened and extended beyond Moscow.
Yeah. I was going to say, to the footnote on the European Security Treaty put forward by Medvedev in 2008-2009, but which, touching on the point you've just made, is that right at the beginning, Moscow and others were very keen that the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, would become the major security provider in Europe. And of course, this was very much pushed forwards by Boris Yeltsin. And it was when he understood towards the end of 1994 that in fact Partnership for Peace would not be an alternative to NATO enlargement, but just the preparatory path towards it, then he was the one who first used the term Cold Peace in December 1994. So even then, we've had those issues, as we see. And of course, and it's interesting, that was towards the beginning. And at the end, in December 2021, just last year, that the Moscow government administration put forward the idea of these two new security treaties, one with NATO, one with the United States. Interesting that Europe didn't figure in all of that as such, apart from as a member of NATO, of course. And the fact that, okay, maybe they were put forward in a rather stark and harsh manner, those demands, but nevertheless, they could have opened the door to some sort of more substantive diplomatic process. The door wasn't entirely closed from as far as the United States was concerned, but it was just kept ajar, perhaps just a little bit too tightly for Moscow. And of course, it then led on to where we are today.
This is the OSCE. I mean, Russia made many commitments there when it thought that this would be this inclusive institution representing Greater Europe. In one of these agreements at the OSCE, Russia committed itself to pulling its peacekeepers out of both Georgia and Moldova. This was in the 90s, but I remember 11 years ago, I was at the Russian embassy in Moldova, and the ambassador was telling me, well, listen, this was when we believed that the OSCE could be the common institution for Europe. When we realized that the Russians would leave, it would be simply replaced by NATO. It wouldn't be Russia leaving and replaced with a common Europe. It would instead be Russia leaving and replaced with NATO, and then they would expect, the de-Russification, removal of Russian language, and then slowly incorporate into this political West, including the military architecture. So it's this. I think often these narratives have been accepted that Russia's just expanding and an expansionist power, but indeed there's a lot of evidence pointing to the fact that their ability to pull back was made very problematic by the absence of any political settlements, given that all the origins of the Charter of Paris for New Europe in 1990, all of it was effectively dismantled, and again, NATO expansionism became the alternative. So at least that's how the Russians portray it, though.
Absolutely. In my opinion, one of the other factors in this effect, this collapse, this catastrophe that we've seen, and it is a European catastrophe. Let's be absolutely clear about this. It's massively problematic for Russia. It's disastrous for Ukraine. It's very bad for Europe and for world peace as well. But one of the key factors also has been the political weakness in Germany, because Germany, in my opinion, has been the pivotal power. The United States, like every great power, wants to preserve its political influence in Europe. I mean, that's what great powers do. You can't, it's not a surprise that the Americans approached it in this way. You can see how other important powers in Europe maneuver. I mean, the British want to keep the Americans in. The country that should have understood and that sometimes appeared to understand the importance of maintaining this relationship with Russia, the fact that the relationship between Germany and Russia is pivotal to maintaining peace in Europe, ought to have been Germany itself. And I think one of the things that we have to, well, future historians perhaps, historians today, people today, scholars today, perhaps need to consider is how it came about that we had a political class, a political system in Germany that never seemed to understand this, or at least never really was able to build on the successes of Ostpolitik, and lost sight of the critical importance of that relationship, because of course if there'd been a strong leadership in Germany committed to achieving the goals that we saw outlined at the end of the Cold War, then of course that would have been a great anchor that would have stabilized the system. That wasn't there. Helmut Kohl himself had some understandings to that effect. So did Schroeder, perhaps to a greater extent. So did Merkel. But it's clear that they were operating in a very shallow political consensus within Germany, which has been upturned incredibly fast.
Yeah, and building on that, one can argue that membership in this political West, and it means specifically European Union and NATO and other bodies, effectively, you use the word shallow, but I can push that a bit further, and to say that effectively, in terms of diplomacy, they have been neutered. That the ability of Germany or France to pursue a genuinely independent foreign policy, a la de Gaulle at an earlier age, even earlier when the political West was just taking shape, that the bloc discipline now is more intense than even earlier in some ways. And we saw this in the laudable, in my view, attempts of both Scholz and Macron in the months, weeks before the war in February 2022 to go to Moscow to hammer out some sort of diplomatic solution. And as I say, these were highly, in my view, commendable attempts to exert an independent European foreign policy, but their attempts had no traction whatsoever. They just, because they were not deciders, they were not the playmakers, as it were. And this was one of the great tragedies, because those great diplomatic powers, great powers, France and Germany and Italy, one has to say, could have played a very positive role in all of this as mediators, as those who understood Moscow, and of course, are not far, as Europeans are still share so much in common with the Russian people, Russian society, on the cultural level, a civilizational level, but not at the political West level. So they were neutered and so on. And just one other point, we talk about NATO enlargement as the big issue, just to make absolutely clear that in the months and run up to the war, NATO enlargement to Ukraine was not on the agenda. And it was quite clear, everybody understood it was not going to be. And so therefore, this is often used as an argument to say Russia's concerns were not serious, they were just pretending, and ultimately it was more a neo-imperialist or colonialist or whatever sort of agenda was being pursued there. Perhaps there's something to that, but certainly the key concern wasn't so much the expansion of NATO as such. It was the expansion of the political West, which can take many, and it's a polyphonous West. It takes, if you push back on the one, it pushes on the other one. And in this case, it would have been US bases, specifically Anglo-American. As we know, the British had signed this £1.5 billion deal to develop the Ukrainian Navy based in Nikolaev. And the United States, of course, would ultimately, and this was already mentioned by Putin in 2014, that Sevastopol wasn't going to fall into the hands of NATO, it would fall into the hands of the United States. So, so that argument needs to be put into that particular context, because we always obsessed by NATO enlargement. It's bigger than that in all sorts of ways, which you've alluded to, EU enlargement and all the rest. And indeed, the enlargement of a particular normative agenda. I'm not talking about the normative agenda based on the United Nations and so on, which we all, certainly I do, am committed to those principles, but it's specifically the way that they're shaped and interpreted by that so-called rules-based order, which is a subset, which is the based on the political West and its enlargement of its particular vision of how international politics should be conducted, how societies should be organized. Of course, we can agree with many of those principles. Of course we can. But it's that power element at its heart, which Moscow, Beijing, India, and even now we now see Indonesia cannot and will not buy into.
But do you see then Germany's role in this conflict? Is it that of a belligerence or weakness? Because I'm thinking when the war broke out in 2014 first, there was the British and the French primarily who rushed to get a peace agreement in place. I'm thinking primarily about the Minsk II agreement, which was very much acceptable to Russia. It was accepted by Ukraine. This is February of 2015, and but yet it was never implemented. Kyiv has, in the more recent months, been very open that they had no intention of implementing it, that they saw it as a way of buying time. But more importantly, the Germans and the French, they never pressured Kyiv to implement the Minsk peace agreement. And it would seem that Britain and especially the United States contributed to pouring cold water on it and offering arms instead, and instead of pressuring this peace agreement through. So I'm just wondering do you see this as being a German weakness that they didn't push their own peace agreement, or did they have a...
I think it must be seen in part as German weakness, because of course Merkel played an absolutely instrumental role in negotiating Minsk II. I mean, we had this fighting in eastern Ukraine. Merkel made this dash to Moscow. She had this meeting with Putin in which they didn't even have interpreters present. Then there was this calling together of everybody in Minsk. And then over the course of that, with Merkel physically there and with Hollande also physically there, Minsk II is hammered out. And of course, it was supposed to be the roadmap to peace in Ukraine. And a very detailed roadmap. I mean, it sets dates by which certain things were supposed to be done, which of course never happened. And given the role that Germany had in hammering out Minsk II, given the fact that Germany was in effect acting as the broker on behalf of Ukraine, it ought to have been Germany together with France that basically told Ukraine, Poroshenko, it is absolutely in your interest. It is absolutely in the interests of Europe that you must implement Minsk II. Poroshenko has said that he was never intended to implement it at all. And Merkel's job ought to have been to tell him, well, you can't do that. This is simply not acceptable. Germany won't support you if you do. And of course, that never happened. And why didn't it happen? Well, it didn't happen because, of course, Germany wasn't ultimately strong enough. Merkel wasn't strong enough to go against the Anglo-American axis, which didn't like Minsk II. And I think in terms of Britain, by the way, one aspect about Minsk II, which I think must have upset the British very, very considerably indeed, is that they weren't informed or consulted about it. It was a European treaty establishing peace in Europe, in which Britain had no voice and from which it was completely excluded from the diplomacy. So if only for that reason, there must have been people in London who were unhappy about it and who were feeling that the Germans and the Russians were perhaps getting too close, and therefore you had to work overtime to try to overturn this whole thing. But if Germany had exerted itself, if it had come and told London and Washington, Minsk II, implementing Minsk II is an absolutely vital German interest, it's a vital European interest, then perhaps something might have happened. But Merkel never felt strong enough in Germany to do that. Perhaps her own inclinations were divided anyway. She's a complex person, and she wasn't prepared to break with the Americans and the British. And one senses also that she probably sensed that within Germany itself, the consensus to see Minsk II done simply wasn't fully there.
And add 2 points to that. It's even worse in some ways, because the Minsk then became the condition for the 6-monthly renewal of sanctions on Russia. Obviously, in comparison to the sanctions today, they were pretty light. But nevertheless, it began and forced a negative transformation of the European Union itself into, let's not be too simplistic, but into an anti-Moscow alliance, a more militarized one, or certainly at that stage, a more punitive one, let's put it this way, which was exactly a repudiation of those principles on which I would in the old days have supported the European Union as a peace project, as an attempt to achieve peace and reconciliation. And so Minsk had this really negative effect. And why did Merkel, as a leader, every 6 months make sure that, because these 6 months had to be done by unanimity, and Germany and Merkel imposed it. So it's even worse than that in doing that. And the second point is, of course, one reason why they didn't really push it is because of the enormously powerful so-called anti-capitulationist lobby within Ukraine itself. So they were frightened. You can understand the logic of the politics, because they felt first that it would lead to the downfall of Poroshenko. And later on, as Zelensky, who was elected in April 2019, both were elected, of course, as peace candidates, because reflecting the enormous desire of the Ukrainian people, who didn't want to be forced to choose. They just wanted to get on with their lives and to live normally, which is something which we would all support. But instead of which, this anti-capitulationist bloc absolutely blocked discussions, because in the Zelensky format, he actually, of course, did, in the framework of Normandy, meet in France with Putin in December 2019, hosted by Macron. And so Minsk, in a sense, is symbolic. Yes, it was a very detailed timetable of what should be done, but it was also a gateway to a negotiating process. And that should have been exploited more. And even if, okay, Kiev wasn't happy with the actual details of Minsk, fine, okay, say it, make it explicit, then you would have not had these endless sanctions on Russia earlier, and you would have actually had some sort of pathway to a genuine negotiation. So it was a political bankruptcy and diplomatic bankruptcy all around, and Minsk, because I agree completely, it was a pathway, not in the black letter of what the Minsk said, but a pathway to achieve a negotiated resolution of this conflict. And that makes it even more tragic, because within that framework, the conflict was avoidable. And it was preventable. There were, I mean, why did Putin go and meet Zelensky in December 2019 after all? So it was a desperate attempt to resolve these accumulating contradictions. And so the tragedy was, for the sort of reasons we've been discussing, the inability of the European powers to genuinely lead. It's a failure of their leadership in personal terms, as you've mentioned, for Merkel. But it's also in institutional framework sense that the political West simply cannot, its elements cannot ultimately withstand a Washington-based agenda, which of course is divided in its own way, but nevertheless, ultimately does not have European concerns at its heart.
No.
I saw an interview with Boris Johnson recently, where he kind of made this point that once the war began, Germany had believed that this was merely continuing down this path would mainly sever or destroy the economies of Europe, and it would destroy relations with Russia, and it would likely bring out more conflict in Ukraine. So they wanted to get this over with as quick as possible, pushing for Ukraine to make a compromise. And Boris Johnson kind of did his little bragging, where he kind of showed how they convince the Germans to don't go this way. Let us instead arm Ukraine to the teeth and win the war. So it seemed like Germany had this initial impulse, but was this weakness again? And again, one can look at how Germany kind of has been flipped, if you will. But I've heard you, Richard, talk about Zelensky once as a tragic actor, I think, because of the peace mandate, as you referred to, how he was elected, and How would you explain this transformation of Zelensky? Because he these days it's easy to forget, but he was elected on a peace platform. And how do you see this transformation?
Even more than that, of course, Zelensky is a Russian speaker from Kryvyi Rog, so a native Russian speaker. And more than that, if you watch his videos going back a good few years, and some of his comedy routines, which were just excellent, one has to say. I'm not just talking about his fantastic television program, Servant of the People, but some of his podcasts earlier, which he understood Russia and its concerns 100%. Very few people did. So when he was elected in April, we thought, oh, fantastic. This is really somebody who will be able to understand what Russia's concerns, because he comes from that Russophone culture, which was extremely important, which makes, of course, and his ability to engage in December 2019 was very positive, though he never followed up. But even as he was meeting Putin, there were the anti-capitulationists, let's call them that, the nationalists were meeting in the Maidan and warning him that if he capitulates, he wouldn't be coming back as leader back to Kiev. So in other words, the tragedy amongst the many tragedies of Ukraine is the way the political agenda is hijacked by a particular element of Ukrainian society, one which has a particular vision of how Ukraine should go, and it does not include a generous, inclusive settlement at the constitutional level for the Russophone population, hence the alienation in Odessa, the alienation in Donbass, and obviously Crimea. And effectively, we know that after he came back from France in 2019, in February, that famous meeting in the border of Lugansk People's Republic, where he basically did that flip, to use your word, and then became the leader of precisely what I've always called that monist, that single vision of Ukraine. Obviously, Ukraine should be dominated by Ukrainian language and culture. Of course, that's a part of a nation-building exercise. But to be done in this exclusive and intolerant way at the civic level, at the constitutional level, then he becomes the leader of the nationalists rather than the tamer of these nationalist passions, even though that nationalist settlement can be open, very generous, very open. Obviously, he's a Jewish person himself. And so but we do know that nationalist monist group, let's call them anti-capitulationists, are extraordinarily militaristic, extraordinarily vindictive, extraordinarily exclusive, and these are the people, of course, who hijacked what could have been, at the Maidan revolution in February 2014. So he wasn't able to face it down, and this is the tragedy.
Can I just say, going back to Richard's original points about the three Wests, the civilizational, cultural, and political West, one of the other great tragedies of this crisis is the way that the political West has de facto ended up in an alliance with this, what Richard calls the anti-capitulationist element within Ukraine, in a way that actually contradicts the best things about the civilizational and cultural West that Richard has been talking about. If you look back to European history, going back, say, at least to, say, the 18th century, Russia was absolutely part of that cultural West. But somehow, some way, we've ended up, again, because it isn't the first time, trying to exclude a part of that cultural West, in this case, the Russian part, from the entire political, even cultural, elements that make up the West today. And it's really horrifying. And what is also, I find actually disturbing. Now, one mustn't exaggerate the extent of this, but the extent to which some of that very intolerance towards Russian culture, language, literature that you see from these anti-capitulationists in Ukraine itself has to some extent now been imported into the West itself, at least into Europe itself. And, I don't want to overstate this, but you're both academics. You're aware of the pressure that some people in the academic world have come under. I have friends in the cultural world. I know how, for example, Russian conductors have been told to leave European opera companies, things of this kind. People have no connection with the politics of this, but simply because they're Russian. And it is one of the stark contradictions that this policy has ended up with, in that it has supporting, in effect, de facto, these anti-capitulationists, who were never that many historically, has checkmated all attempts to achieve peace in Ukraine. And it's also introduced into Europe, in my opinion, an extremely dangerous and ugly and deeply unpleasant style of politics, which, frankly, I abhor.
Yeah. Can I just elaborate a little bit on that? So one immediate consequence is that the European Union, for example, is imposing a collective guilt on the whole Russian people, which is indeed, as you say, antithetical to those best traditions of the cultural and civilizational West, which is, of course, typical of possibly a political West. And this does bear more discussion, because this collective guilt issue can open the door, and it has opened the door to so much injustice, so much suffering, even, and it's also, as you say, transforming not just a political West in the abstract, but European Commission today is militarized. It's now becoming militant. It's now becoming intolerant. And the fact that it itself is propounding these, is at the forefront of even petty acts. For example, a little example which has affected so many of my friends who fled Russia for various anti-war reasons, just like Americans used to escape in the Vietnam War to Canada. But no one ever thought that Canadians would block US bank accounts so they couldn't take their money out in Canada. This is what European Commission leader has actually done. She personally, as well, Washington, to block the use of the mere credit card, the card, so that they could access money in Turkey. She specifically warned Denizbank, for example, just one of the leading Turkish bank, that if you don't block these cards. But the people who've left, on the whole, are opposed to the war. And so basically, implicitly, they're saying that you are now being blamed for not having overthrown your own government, which, of course, for most normal people is just absurd. So we've got, as you say, undermining the very values of a political West, which, to push Alexander's point a little bit further, ultimately is sowing the seeds, first, of a huge backlash from Russia and everybody else, but also a further political degradation of our own civic culture, our traditions of tolerance and traditions of inclusivity. And we've all, I think all three of us have probably suffered from it quite extensively. And this political atmosphere of the Second Cold War, in some ways, is worse, far worse than it was in the First Cold War. At least then we knew communists versus capitalists. Today, anybody can fall victim to this, even those opposed to the present system. We know, for our Russian friends, opposed to the system in Kremlin today. So can I just make another point, which is following on from Alexander's point, and that is that we mentioned earlier the counterpart, the emergence of a political East with, it's all various bodies. But just one specific point in all of this, it means that when in Russia, as one of the leaders of this nascent, it's just the really beginning of the political East, it is very much political, but it doesn't have such deep cultural or civilizational foundations of the East. So it's the reverse side, if you like, of its relationship with the political West, which means that it's more contingent and perhaps less deeply founded. And I think many Chinese and Indian commentators would say this, that Russia is just turning to the East because it's been rebuffed in the West. I think it's deeper than that, but nevertheless, there is a conceptual framework and foundation for that view.
Absolutely. I mean, if I can just say, we've all been to Moscow, we've all been to St. Petersburg, we've all been to other Russian cities. To me, they're profoundly European, actually. I mean, Moscow, I would say, I mean, can easily fit as a European city. If you go further east, if you go to China, if you go to Shanghai, well, you see a cultural difference. I mean, there's no doubt about that. So I think that's absolutely correct, and it is creating a division in Europe. And by the way, and this is perhaps coming back to the points about the political West, it's, I think, going to start creating political divisions within the political West itself. We now see Germany and France at odds to an extent that has not been true for a very, very long time. Relations between the French and German governments have become bad and getting worse. The French feel increasingly excluded from German decision making. One gets the sense that the French all along have had more misgivings about this entire Ukrainian process than anybody else has done amongst the major Western powers, but they've always been marginalized and forced to go along with things which perhaps deep down they don't really fully agree with. We see relations between Italy and France, two traditional allies, becoming very, very bad. And going back to Boris Johnson's, I thought, incredibly mischievous interview, by the way, and I agree, by the way, also with the way in which the Germans has responded, you know, that we must always be careful, because with Johnson, he does have his own, you know, connection to the truth, which isn't that which many other people would have. But you can see also a kind of anti-German narrative in Britain that's starting to build out that Germans aren't really reliable, that they're pusillanimous, that they pursue mercantilist policies, and there's some Germans who are good, but there are other Germans who are not so good. Tensions, which I never once thought to see.
This is why I'm also a bit skeptical about this solidarity in the West, because when Russia invaded the Ukraine, you know, it was supposed to revitalize Western unity and you know, bring back to life even NATO. So yeah, a lot of discussion around this. But no, as you mentioned, this seems to be a lot of, especially with the economic problems, a lot of turning on each other. So the French and Italians, the French and the Germans, you have, of course, the British. But of course, I think the most important one is possibly the United States and the EU. I think, yeah, the Europeans were cautious, or you know, pointed to Russia when the Nord Stream pipelines were attacked. I can't believe anyone actually believes that this is that Russia attack their own pipelines. But again, we're saying that Russia's bombing nuclear power plants under its own control as well. So so why not? But I'm guessing with the loss of these pipelines. But now, you know, there wasn't anything in the media. No one, you know, everyone said it was outrageous to say even the US had any interest in this. But now, with this Inflation Reduction Act, there's some very loud voices coming out of Europe now. Even I think it was yesterday, there was an article saying that this is an existential threat to European industries, that all these industries will now go across the Atlantic, and effectively America's destroying the European industry. I mean, this is very strong language, and that the Europeans are ramping up for a trade war with the US. But again, it's not just the West. Between the US and EU who's been fragmented. This also within the EU is fragmentation, and even, you know, now we have the EU putting sanctions on Hungary, and this also Poland isn't really treated, I would say, that fairly. Of course, they have their problems, but it just seems like the European tent, which was supposed to be all inclusive, keeps getting smaller and smaller. Even within the states, you have a huge political polarization. You know, political opposition is not an opposition, but they become an enemy. You know, it's one's right and one wrong. You see this on both sides. It's just I don't know. It's I'm curious. What do you think? Is this a temporary thing, or is this part of a permanent fragmentation?
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right that the tensions within the political West are becoming far more intense at all levels because, for example, in addition to what you've just said, the concern that Trump or some Trumpian figure will be elected in the United States in 2024 is leading many European voices to say, look, we cannot rely on the United States for security. We should have done that. We should do more ourselves. But that sort of discourse in the past would have been very good. It would have been a balance to balance the Washington-led vision of European security and global issues as well. Instead of which now it's done, if you like, without unable to break out from the rather narrow vision. So if you're trying to arm Europe against Russia, well, that's a fat lot of good, and I don't think that's taken us very far at all. What we do look forwards to is some sort of genuine European leadership, and Macron at moments has shown the ability, and so has Scholz, by the way, to provide a sort of leadership which can break out from that total deadlock in which we are, that impasse. And it's that impasse is generating all those tensions which you've alluded to internally. And of course, there have been these tensions have been building up because that very model of deindustrialization, globalization, which of course led to the emergence of very powerful national populist movements in all these states. And one way in which I begin to have a look at it is that one of the great dangers has been for so many years is that the political West has become hermetic. That means closed, that it simply cannot listen to voices outside of it, that they know they don't have legitimacy, that the only legitimacy comes from those generated from within the political West itself. Those are the only valid interlocutors. All the rest are potential allies, and hence they're trying to drag India in on the Western side, or enemies, which China is increasingly framed as. And of course, that puts the Russian conflict in context, because clearly one of the subtexts to all of what's going on is that the political West is Washington, so let's weaken Russia first, and before we can move on, as it were, an hors d'oeuvre, before we move on to the main dish, which is, of course, a nice extended conflict with China, which is an insanity. This is so much deeply embedded in a logic which didn't exist before the Second World War. And it is simply that Cold War political West logic. And that's why I think my intellectual attempt now is to unpick this closure of the political West, both in military and other terms, and in fact, by definition, it's inherent militarism. And the tragedy is that militarism has now infected the European Union, at the European Commission at that level, in a language which one could not believe just even a few years ago, the way that this whole element has become closed and hermetic and militaristic. And that's why, we need to devise a genuine language to move towards a peace agenda, an anti-militaristic agenda, to break out from all of this, while preserving the best of the West, which is its civilizational achievements, its cultural achievements, and all the rest. But to say, look, this political West is an incubus, which was shaped by this, and of course, you could say the military-industrial complex and deep state. We don't need to go into that, but certainly it's absolutely clear if you look at the United States, the way that the billions and trillions being spent on nuclear modernization at the time when it's running a national debt of $30 trillion, which is about, I think, 135, if not more, % of its GDP. And of course, the US infrastructure is decaying, public schools are decaying. It's almost down to a third world. And I won't talk about the UK in that context either. I leave that.
No. Yeah, I mean, I will just say this. I mean, what Richard has described is the consequence of the failure to achieve peace. If we'd achieved peace at the end of the Cold War, a lot of these problems would not arise, because militarism, a hermetic, closed society, one is just policing language increasingly. And I mean, I'm not, this has taken many forms, but there's been a militarism of language as well, an intolerance, and a refusal to conduct debate, for example. I mean, just one example. I mean, we spoke about the rules-based international order. You often see this expression now in the media, in Britain at least, and in the United States, I've never actually seen in any media outlet, maybe it exists somewhere, but I've never actually seen an explanation of what it is. Nobody's able to discuss this, because we mustn't discuss it. It's doing so is, again, to sort of go deep into things which might open questions and ask questions about how this is really consistent with the United Nations and its charter, which we really don't want to go to. So we cut down discussions. We do all of these things with each other. Now, anybody who knows anything about hermetic societies, closed societies, will know that always beneath the surface, tensions are always there. Resentments are always there. They're getting stronger. Acrimony, dislike of each other intensifies. There's always the concern that the other person, it's not just that they have a different view, but that they might actually be traitors. And some of the way in which people talk in Britain, for example, about certain German politicians, Gerhard Schröder, for example, almost you could see that, that this person is seen as a traitor to the West. We've now had the French Interior Minister talking about the Italian government, the present Italian government, as an enemy of France. And this kind of language is a product of a failure to achieve peace and an atmosphere of, well, we're almost at war, but we're not really quite there because nuclear weapons are such a threat and we can't really let the thing go quite that fast. So we're caught in this system of, if you like, almost war, never peace, but one which perpetuates itself indefinitely. It's a kind of tunnel that we don't really see a way out of. And in the meantime, all of these tensions are there, building, getting worse all the time, and all the problems that Richard was talking about in our societies are going unaddressed. I'm not going to talk about Britain, it's too depressing. But I mean, United States, you see this in Germany too. I mean, a friend of mine was struggling with the collapse of the German railway system, which is apparently even worse than in Britain, which seems incredible to me. But all of these problems are going unaddressed because we're all absorbed within this war, which isn't actually a war, and which we can't find a way out of, and which we can't somehow resolve.
Well, I think that's the greatest challenge of this war in Ukraine, because any solution between Russia and Ukraine at some level has to address the European security order. If we accept that this war is a symptom of the breakdown of this pan-European security architecture, and what's missing from the debate, to the extent I'm almost impressed it's absent, is this reluctance to give up on this hegemonic order which we aspired for after the Cold War, because I'm not sure how it would work. If you look back in the 1990s, all the economic power in the world was concentrated in the West. We had the power on our side. If you looked at the main rivals, be it China or counterparts, China and Russia, their main foreign policy was to a large extent to find ways of aligning themselves and get along with the West, with Russia to become part of the West. They were as pro-Western could be. We had all the economic power, and still we ended up we ended up in this situation. And but nonetheless, there's no desire, it seems, to reconsider this. That perhaps go back 30 years and, well, if it didn't work then, we're not going to be able to put Humpty Dumpty back together now and revert to this order. It's just surprising that there's no discussion at all. And anyone who would suggest it, you would have these common phrases, this would be appeasement or rewarding Putin, or, this is just what Hitler wanted, this kind of catchphrases, which doesn't really make sense. I'm not sure. Is this why diplomacy is so difficult? Because I guess in this war, what has surprised me the most is the absence of diplomacy. Now, I got it in the early stages of the war. I mean, both sides of the conflict believed that they had a chance of winning and they could gain more. So again, you don't want to settle today if you can get a better deal tomorrow. But at the moment, just like the European security architecture is collapsing, we see on the Ukrainian side this huge casualties way out of proportion of what's happening on the Russian side. See loss of all this military equipment, and then you have even the West seems to be confirming now that their storages are running low, and also the Western economies are really struggling now, especially the Europeans, and they were struggling even before the war. And now with these political consequences of the crisis, it just and then you look at the other side. The Russians have now almost finished their mobilization. They've all been integrated to their units. They're tripling their fighting force. They opened up their weapons storage. I just saw the TOS, what's called fire launchers. This horrific weapon, I would say, but also all this new T-80 tanks coming out of storage. I mean, this is going to be a horrible offensive. It appears why, if you wanted diplomacy, well, best possible deal. Why is there no diplomacy? This is something genuinely surprising me. If you believe that you can get a worse deal tomorrow than today, why are we still going? Not even talking to Moscow. I mean, this is just incomprehensible. We always had. It's a direct chance of a nuclear war with Russia. We would get on a plane to Moscow. We would find some settlement, but nothing. Honestly, it perplexes me. That's all.
Yeah, if we compare what's going on now with a slow motion Cuban Missile Crisis, which of course was resolved by diplomacy, by back channel diplomacy, as we know, within 2 or 3 days in October 1962, Bob Kennedy was actually meeting the Soviet ambassador Dobrinin in the Soviet embassy and other back channels and so on. And so, but what we've seen now is where I say this is worse and more dangerous than the first Cold War, because of the death of diplomacy. And this has been something which has been going on since the end of the Cold War, for the reasons which we've been alluding to, is that if you have this hermetic closed political West, which believes it is the fount of all virtue, and therefore everybody outside of it, of course, is the fount of all evil, then how can you really talk with a malign force? How can you talk to evil? How can you engage with it? Of course you don't. All you can do is beat it, marginalize it, contain it. It's that Manichaeanism, which I think you've written about in your own works earlier. And so, but of course, you can't have diplomacy with this because, European Union, as their excellent work by Sergei Prozorov has shown, doesn't do international relations. It can't have diplomacy with other countries because it's expanding its own normative vision of the world, which is a very benign and good vision, by the way. But nevertheless, its downside is because it doesn't engage with the other as equals, it engages with the other as an object to change, to become more like us. But what if the other says, we don't want to become like you? We've got different traditions. We've got a different lifestyle, different cultures and civilizations than we have exactly. And just to say that the diplomacy, of course, took a particularly harsh blow in those Trump years, well, just towards the end of Obama, when we started this death cycle of expulsion of diplomats. The expulsion of diplomats, Obama did it in December 2016. 35 Russian diplomats were expelled. And now, basically, both Russia and the United States have a skeletal representation in their mutual capitals. It's absolutely shocking. And of course, the worst thing is that in a conflict like this, in the old days, we would see the United Nations and its General Secretary absolutely leading discussions, and of course it hasn't. Washington has barely engaged. We had that meeting in Ankara with Sergei Naryshkin, head of the Russian GRU, and William Burns, the head of the CIA, which was the first in 6 months serious substantive meeting. We don't know what they were saying. And of course, the European Commission. We would have expected to be a peacemaker, instead of which it's now, instead of acting as a forum for the solution of conflict, it becomes a venue for their amplification and intensification.
And I think that's the problem with the liberal ideology. I mean, liberal values. I think these are wonderful values. Some of the strengths of Western civilization, but I do think that the ideology that accompanies it has made diplomacy much more difficult. Because if you see, as mentioned, that not sovereign equals, but there's good values and bad values, good actors and worst. And this is to a large extent how not just the EU but the US sees itself as well. It's supposed to socialize the world around them, to convert them into good people, if you will, like us with our values. Now, the problem there is, in such an instance, you can't have compromise, because if good compromises with evil, well, that's appeasement. If you want advancement, good has to be victorious over the bad values as well. So you see this also to some extent in the formats of diplomacy. I mean, often countries are invited to diplomatic meetings with the leaders if, as a reward, if they have accepted the diktats of Washington or Brussels. And in contrast, if we disagree on something, they actually freeze you out, which I find so fascinating. This is in the verge, possibly on the way to nuclear war. And people, the biggest thing they can do is this huge G20 diplomatic event is, planning walkouts and not taking pictures together and not being seen to talk to the Russians, because this can give them legitimacy. And this is the new aspect. I think the idea that diplomacy gives legitimacy to the other side, it becomes criminalize diplomacy, if you will. And so I think this is the main problem. If you see yourself as a civilizational teacher or a teacher of values, and you divide the world into teachers and students, and again, the teacher shouldn't compromise with the student. And this is to a large extent under this liberal hegemony. I think how we in the West tend to organize relations with others. This is a relationship with a subject and object. The subject shall make the decisions. We have the better values, and the object, the pieces who should be moved around. The problem is, this is the liberal hegemony, which we established after the Cold War. The problem is now, it like any world order, it relies on both power distribution and legitimacy. Now, the distribution is quite different now. A lot of the power of the world has shifted to the East, than primarily China, but also the larger East. And second, the legitimacy is gone. I think after 30 years of various wars and outside of the West, there's less legitimacy for this idea that the West will be a benign ruler. Just and I think all of this has miscolored or corrupted the purpose of diplomacy. At least what often the West considers to be the goal of diplomacy. So, but still, yeah.
I think you make many very important points there. Firstly, let's talk about ideology, because you talk about liberal ideology. Liberalism has always been one of those words which changes its meaning rather easily and rather a lot. But whatever one can think of about liberalism, I mean, what is called liberalism in the West today has calcified into something which is profoundly different from the liberalism that was such an important part of European culture, of the European civilizational model, that Richard was talking about. I mean, we have moved very, very far from the liberalism, one would associate with someone like Voltaire and J.S. Mill. I mean, Voltaire, who hated fanaticism, who abhorred wars. I mean, you only have to read Voltaire's works to see this. It's become something which I would say contradicts so much of its essential meaning nowadays. It's, again, we conduct our politics in a certain way that is liberal. If you don't conduct your politics in that kind of way, well, that means you're not only not liberal, but you're also by definition bad. Now, that's exactly what historic liberals said you shouldn't do. You should have open debate, open discussion. You should listen to other people's points of view. Voltaire never actually did say it about, I disagree with you completely, but, I would fight to the death for your right to believe what you do believe. Voltaire never actually said that, but it's the kind of thing he might have said. Well, we don't think like that any longer. And if anybody, as I said, doesn't agree with us on any particular aspect of whatever it is we're doing at the moment, well, that means that we are enemies of liberalism, enemies of democracy. We must be suppressed. We must be closed down, all of that sort of thing. And I think that's part of this closed, hermetic West that Richard was talking about. Now, about the breakdown of diplomacy, and I'm going to say, I don't particularly want to single out one particular country, but I think here we have one of the real problems with the political West and the dominance within it of the United States, because historically, over the course of its history, the United States has not done much diplomacy. In Europe, we're talking about the civilizational West that Richard was talking about. We've had a multiplicity of countries, of powers. We've had long histories of wars, but also of diplomacy with each other. We established the techniques of modern diplomacy, or the political language of diplomacy, which is largely French today, for example. I mean, it came from Europe. We had ambassadors. We had a whole system of diplomacy because we all had to find some means, even during periods of war, of getting along with each other. The United States has been different because it has always operated in an environment where it has been uniquely powerful in relation to everyone around itself. So it's always been the most powerful state in the Americas. After the First and Second World Wars, it became the most powerful state globally. So the American vision of diplomacy, except during a certain period, during the Second World War and the Cold War, when it had to be more diplomatic in some of the things that it was doing. The American vision has always been the United States decides, the others accept, because American power has been so overwhelming that it's been able to impose its views on everyone else. And of course, after its conception that he'd won the Cold War, and with this ultimately rather brief period that it achieved in the 1990s, where it appeared to be not just the superpower, but the hyperpower, one can easily see how it reverted back to that kind of mindset, because there was no other power that could remotely challenge American power in, say, 1995, 2000, or whatever. The fundamental problem is that, exactly as you said, Glenn, the world has changed, and it is changing profoundly. And the United States is not adjusting its ideas to the extent of that change, because I suspect that it's very difficult for it to do so. It would mean, for example, accepting that the victory it thought it had achieved at the end of the Cold War, or has told itself it has achieved, is not actually as total or as complete or as final as it wants to believe. So the very great risk that we run in the West is that eventually a solution, a way out of this cul-de-sac that we've got ourselves into, because we're not prepared to engage in diplomacy, we're not prepared to work with other powers, that eventually a solution is going to be imposed upon us by outsiders, not by the Russians, they're not powerful enough, but one can see how other states working together, the Indians, the Chinese, the Russians, of course, but others too, might say enough's enough. We're not prepared to work within the global economic and financial system in the way that we used to. We're not prepared to accept your control of the system in the way that it was. We're going to reshape the system, impose our own ideas on how it should operate. And we in the West will be forced to adjust to this at a time when we have given up our ability to have a say. And that is a real risk, I think, that we run.
Yeah, that's interesting, this last point. It's just like the United States acted as an honest broker at the end of the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. So today, China, possibly a combination with India, would be, and it would be a sign of their emergence as global powers and global diplomatic weight. But another point, just to gloss some of what you've just said, is that we shouldn't forget that within the United States, of course, there are various traditions. And of course, there is, if you like, the conservative, the classic conservative liberal view, but certainly conservative American tradition of not isolationist, but of conservative internationalism, which argues that the United States should act as that, to use the classic term, the shining beacon of the hill on a hill. It should be an example. It should do what it practices, and so therefore act as a light for the rest of humanity, as an example, and therefore would mean good governance and effective social welfare and so on. Unfortunately, in the post-Cold War years, and in fact, as a result of the first Cold War, it has in fact adopted what you could call a missionary stance. It's actually expansionist, and as we know, the classic European missionaries who didn't really have enormous respect, some of them did, for native indigenous societies, but their job was to change them, to convert them, of course, even though some of them respected the cultures, but nevertheless, their job was different. And so it's that tragedy, is that both the neocons in the US and the liberal interventionists have this sort of missionary, for different reasons, but this missionary angle, and all of them, except now a growing movement, is this conservative internationalism, which say, let's focus on our own issues. And the tragedy, of course, in all of this is that Trump, in a sort of intuitive manner, understood this, but then failed to articulate a strategy to do it. And of course, all he did was intensified the contradictions which we've been talking about.
Well, I guess you always had that tension within the United States, because you have previous incidents of this as well, because this United States for a long time wanted to be this, the shining city on the hill, someone to be emulated. But you could argue that even from the days of Woodrow Wilson, when he said, we'll go out and make the world safe for democracy. So, that this also to some extent was a step in that direction of making, converting the US from a country to be emulated to going on this missionary to change the world outside it. And but you also see this on the Republican ticket. I mean, possibly no one else than Reagan was able to, make the democratic peace theory into an imperial project when he, effectively called for, all his big. Also, I guess to some extent, Wilsonian mission of going out and changing the world to make it more democratic. It's a revolution of conservatism, which becomes a contradiction in terms, but nonetheless, it's a very. I'm not sure if there's enough political power in the U.S. to pull it back to reflect current realities. That being said, there's obviously a growing movement where you see. Someone realizing that perhaps they should have chosen a different path the last 30 years. Trump being obviously one of them, but this did not end very well.
I think there is probably a growing movement in the United States. I mean, again, my work brings me quite close to the currents of thinking in the United States, and what Richard was talking about this American conservatism, which is, as Richard correctly says, is not isolationist. It has a vision of the United States as the republic, operating as a republic within itself, an example to other nations, but an example through its own success rather than through its ability to impose its positions on others. This is a powerful message within America that is very attractive to a lot of Americans. I mean, we talk about the benefits of empire, but of course the thing, like with all empires, or at least I don't want to be too doctrinaire, but the thing that happens with many empires, and it's certainly happening in America, is that the benefits of empire, if you like, are huge, but are very unevenly distributed. And so are the burdens. And the burdens are coming to, are falling on the shoulders of the poorer people in the US. Richard was talking about decaying infrastructure, increasing debt, economic problems there. And of course, there are many more of those, whereas the benefits of the empire, again, are falling very much on a minority, a very small, very gilded minority. So there is this class tension about the empire and the republic and all of these things which exists in the United States. And I think it does have traction. Point is, in Europe, we would be, I think, reckless to just say, well, let's wait until the day finally comes when America changes, because we have to look to the problems of our own continent. We can't always turn around and look at the Americans. We have to say sometimes to the Americans, like over Ukraine, Minsk and II, which we talked about, when they had come with their ideas of, expanding eastwards and all of that, we have to say, you're wrong. This is a huge mistake. It's going to be very dangerous for Europe if we go there. And at the same time, we also have to set out and develop our own systems and build our own institutions and find our own ways to secure peace in our own continent. And we can't rely on the Americans to do it for us. I think this has been one of the great errors and tragedies that we've seen over the post-Cold War period. And I think it's been very bad for the Americans that we look to them all the time, because it's strengthened this American belief in their own exceptionalism and their own ability to control and shape everything. And it's also been very bad for us, because it's caused us to see the withering of our own institutions and our own foreign policy autonomy.
So the other side of that, to generate a deep sense of a peace project, if you like, within the West and in particular Europe, as you say, the other side of it is a more substantive developmental vision. By that I mean, perhaps more active industrial policy, because clearly the existing model of globalization has had all sorts of elements which you've talked about, above all the inequality and the fact that its benefits, which have been huge, have in the West fallen so disproportionately onto that golden 1% within our societies. And a developmental strategy isn't just simply an industrial policy, which is part of it, a reindustrialization in the best sense of the word, with new green and modern technologies, with all that, the capacities of human ingenuity and all the achievements of science, which are so often now squandered when we have such huge poverty in our midst, of inequality, poverty, lives blighted in such a fundamental way. And yet the governance in so many of our societies is concerned about external issues, about marginal issues. And that raises two other things which we've talked about, and that is the general quality of discourse, of political debate. Not just the fact that there's an intolerant element to it, but also the lack in that discussion of what used to be even a genuinely dynamic social democratic agenda, welfare, development, and so on. And at the same time, the lack of time horizon. So the only, as you say, the last thing we should do is just to wait for what some people would argue, the inevitable collapse, which of course will take us all down with it. So that's the last thing we need in all sorts of ways. But there is only one time, on the time angle, in Moscow, for example, they do say, in Putin's speech at the Valdai Club this year, for example, did say, basically, this is a decade-long business. So the time horizon is, let's just wait for a decade. The world would then become more multipolar, and assuming that in about a decade, you'll have a stronger China, stronger India, and also what I now call what we all call the middle powers, the Indonesia, the Mexicos, the Brazils, all Argentina, and so many, South Korea, all of those countries which can begin to exert their weight to make it a genuine, break this hermetic lock which the G7 states have had for so long on the global agenda, and to turn that global agenda to a genuine peace and development agenda. So those two things, which sounds all very old-fashioned back to the 1950s, but that was interesting why even at the heart of the first Cold War, this emancipatory vision was still there. What's worse today is only the logic of conflict has been reproduced, but not those creative, progressive solutions within that logic of conflict. So it's a sterile, barren intellectual and political landscape in which we live. And of course, in socioeconomic terms, absolutely catastrophic and heading for far, far worse times for the next 2 or 3 winters.
Well, I think that's why especially Russians see this multipolarity as being the salvation. I'm not sure if they're being overly optimistic, but a key problem of this liberal hegemony after the Cold War was, it's largely based on this, democratic peace theory that if the West leads, it can promote all these values, which will let us transcend the realism of the international system. So effectively, through our values, we promise give the Kantian promise of perpetual peace. But because all these values are linked to the U.S. hegemony or the hegemony of the collective West, it means the West must rule. But at that moment, you see the power shifting away from the West. So this fight now to maintain U.S. hegemony effectively puts us in a situation where we must be committed to perpetual war in order to obtain perpetual peace, and becomes a huge conflict on its own. I just think that the Russian view is to some extent that as power shifts to the east, that doesn't mean Moscow, but the wider east, so India, even Turkey, China, all these other countries in the east as well as Russia. As the power foundations no longer reside there, that the West would. This is what effectively would force the West to accept a return to a multipolar, back to a Westphalian system of the sovereign state, sovereign equality, most important of all, in which the world isn't dictated by the G7. At some point, as the power really drains away from the G7, we will have to come to terms with this new reality. Not there yet, but I'm not sure if it will be that easy. And I also agree, if this ends in some horrendous economic collapse of the West, I don't think that will benefit anyone. So it's let's call it a mess.
Indeed. I'll just say quickly about that, because I found the Valdai speech Putin gave was an extraordinarily interesting one. And it did make me think, not for the first time, once again, what a very old-fashioned and conservative place Moscow in some ways is, because, and what a very European place it is. I mean, in a way, it looks back to the sort of concert of Europe concept of conducting international affairs, which is one which, remember, when, we had a situation before the 20th century, where Russia, in the 18th and 19th century, Russia was an absolute part of the European system. But, you had, if you like, a multipolar Europe at that time. There were the various great powers all operating with each other. They were very different from each other. I mean, the British were more liberal. The French, in some ways, were more liberal too. And of course, they became democratic. The Germans were more conservative. The Russians had an autocracy, but they always sort of worked together. And you had, Russian foreign ministers like Gorchakov and Nesselrode and all of those people, participating in this system. And what Putin is essentially talking about is that system, but it's now got to become the global system. It's going to become a system like that works for everyone, everywhere. It's, in a way, a curious throwback to that past, but also perhaps an attractive project which you can see people in Indonesia, in Brazil, in Nigeria, they might actually be attracted to. And so it was an odd speech in that way, but perhaps an interesting one. It was politically a clever one, I thought. But it both looks back and it looks forward. It looks back to a certain style of diplomacy and a certain style of organizing international relations, whilst at the same time offering that as a model for the future, and perhaps an attractive model.
But the downside of that, no, I mean, that's all, I think I agree with all of that. But the downside, of course, we all know how the Concert of Powers ended in 1914. And therefore, we do need, and this is where the other level comes in, why I constantly stress the importance of the Charter International System. Also, after 1945, we had this UN-based system which establishes the normative and indeed institutional framework in which this international politics of the Concert of Powers takes place. And so until not long ago, Russia, and of course there was this vision and appeal to that international system was at the heart of the Russo-Chinese joint statement of the 4th of February just before. And it's full of this language and the supremacy of the United Nations Security Council and so on and so forth. And so that it's a combination of the two, in other words. At the level of international politics, yes, it is concert powers, sovereign states. However, I don't know, I can't remember who mentioned Westphalian, because I've always argued it's not Westphalian. Yes, Westphalia talked about sovereignty, equality of states, yes, but it didn't talk about internationalism. And so what we now have is this, with this international system since 1945, a genuine attempt to achieve sovereign internationalism. You're sovereign, you may have different sort of systems. This is what Gorbachev appealed to. In that common European home, there would be many different types of social orders and types of states, but they would all get on because they have a larger commitment to finding their own way to modernity, to development, to even to peace. And of course, what this war in Ukraine does is actually threaten that whole post-war order. There's been a unity since 1945 to 2022. And what I'm most concerned about today is that UN-based Charter International System, with all of its excellent normative and other frameworks since then, which has developed and become ever more deep, is in deep crisis. And this war has not just disrupted the balance of power at the level of international politics, which you are alluding to. It's in 1914 situation at the level of international politics. We're now into a 1939 situation in terms of the international system. When 1939, the League of Nations, all the Versailles Peace, which was so flawed in all sorts of ways. And after 1945, the system tried to learn from its failures, in particular by establishing that permanent Security Council and steering mechanism and other elements. And so we are at the moment, on the precipice. So this war could, if we lose that Charter International System and delegitimizing the United Nations, we've got nothing left, and we're really in literally uncharted waters, and so dangerous, which could then lead to a war of all against all. And so, the idea that out of this balance of power, a new order will emerge. Well, we all know that international systems emerge after war. That concert of Europe was after the huge Napoleonic Wars, the Congress of Vienna, and Westphalia itself after that catastrophic 30 Years' War. And I just hope that we can avoid, that we won't end up in a situation where we have to start devising a new international system. Unfortunately, we don't even have the ideas of what could be at the heart of this new international system or organizational reform. There is nothing better than the United Nations system, even though deeply flawed as it is. It must have India as a permanent member of the Security Council, and it should also, of course, have some other countries as well, Brazil, perhaps, and of course a representative from Africa.
Absolutely, I agree with this completely, and I should say that we haven't just thrown away the possibility of peace that might have existed after the end of the Cold War. We've also endangered the peace settlement that was achieved with so much difficulty and which was negotiated so painstakingly after the Second World War, because at the moment we have nothing else. We have nothing to put in place of the United Nations, and no concept of what could be put in place in replacement of the United Nations. The only vision that we've been ever given is of this rules-based order, which is failing and disruptive, and which has never been properly defined. So of course we need to look at the United Nations, and we need to hold on to the United Nations, because of course the point about the United Nations, if you look at the Charter, is that its underlying priority is to preserve peace, and to preserve peace as a way of promoting progress, that they are both there within the United Nations Charter, and that's what makes it attractive. And in fairness, I have to say this, I mean, you know, Putin and the Russians, I talked about how they look back to the concert of Europe and all of this, when Russia was treated as a great power, accepted by the other great powers as a legitimate actor in international affairs. And one can see the attraction to that. But in fairness to Putin and to the Russians, they do talk continuously, all the time, about preserving the United Nations and the structure that it created. And they are amongst the greatest defenders, if you like, of that system at the present time. We have to get through these 10 years that Putin was talking about. I think it's going to be very difficult. I think that we will come through this process in the end. The question for me is how chaotic it will be, the exit point. And I'm going to say it straightforwardly. I mean, what shape will the West be in at the end of that point as well? We talk an awful lot about Russia, but you know, in a way, this is all about the West. This is, if you like, the early stages of what could be, you know, either securing peace or even much more dangerously, you know, the start of the wars of the American succession, which I would certainly not want to see.
Yeah, well, I think that well, the rules-based international order, I think, was born under a specific distribution of power that is a hegemonic one, and yeah. I think there's a good reason to believe it would weaken as a result of you know, the decline of unipolarity. And the reason I say it is there was, you know, a universal commitment to the UN Charter and international law after the Cold War, but I think that as the liberal hegemonic order began to take off, the first point, which, well, the reason for concern was the invasion of Yugoslavia in 1999, because as you remember then, they said it was not legal, but it was legitimate. So I find this to be extraordinary, because this is the first decoupling of legitimacy from legality. And you saw this after the war in Iraq as well, where you know, the leading American scholars as well as politicians were saying very openly, we need a different source of legitimacy. We can't rely on the UN necessarily, because you know, the Russians and the Chinese, they're not liberal democrats like us. They don't understand human rights like we do. That's why we ignored them in 1999. And we should have different authority now. This is when you began to talk about the concert of democracies, the League of Democracies, you know, all of these things. And I think this gradually became the rules-based international order, in which and you didn't only implement different liberal ideals to challenge the sovereign state, but you made this the prerogative of the West. So now it's, you know, obviously no one would accept a Chinese intervention in Laos or a Russian intervention in Ukraine. This is the West. You know, we can interfere in other affairs. We can topple governments. Democratic revolutions. We can invade countries, you know, as humanitarian interventions. This is again, you took this whole value-based liberal ideals and you gave it to one entity of power, which is the hegemon. And this is, I think, as the hegemon declines, there's, you know, reasons to believe that this efforts to alter the international system would yeah, weakened as well. Of course, I could be wrong, but yeah. Richard, I'm not sure how long we have you. It's we almost had you for 2 hours. Do you have time for one final question?
I think if one final, I think that we should wrap up.
Yeah, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah.
I was just finishing off with the actual war, which has the symptom of this crisis of Europe. How do you see this moving forward? I mean, where are we at?
Yeah. Well, I will say this, that it's very difficult. I was going to say a doomed enterprise to try to predict how a war will go, because war by definition is, by these feints, these movements, these false campaigns and so on. So absolutely, it's really tough to say. But as far as we can see, on the one side, you could say that that there's a type of stalemate, that it's the front will move a little bit in the Donbass, but basically we've now we're in for the long haul, and therefore the best we can achieve in this framework, given the fact that there is no clear pathway to peace, is an armistice. And an armistice is what I've been calling for from the very first days, to try to alleviate the suffering of the Ukrainian people, because even early, however dreadful it may have been, you could say the real war until recently hadn't actually begun. I mean, I don't mean this in any way to minimize the terrible suffering and the tragedies which have taken place for a second. But the terrible thing, it could get much worse, and it's getting worse. Of course, now we see with the attacks on the power plants and so on. So this is why I think that those calls for an armistice are just so important, to say, just stop it, but it won't happen. And so, so that's the first model, if you like, a stabilization of the fronts, like in 1914, and then it just goes on for the slog until all sides are so exhausted that they come to the armistice, which they could have done 3 years earlier, of 1980. The second scenario, if you like, is, of course, the one put forward by our military friends, Douglas Macgregor and so on, and others, who are arguing, of course, that Russia is now building up its forces, and I think Alexander alluded to it, the tanks and the military and so on, the vast resources which Russia has, because it does have escalation dominance. I think that was the theme of one of Alexander's talks not long ago, escalation dominance, because it's next door. And it's not just an escalation dominance in terms of military, but it's also an escalation dominance in terms of commitment, because it's next door. It's not like Vietnam, which was 5,000 miles away in the United States. And there was always a commitment problem there, because, what on earth are we doing in Vietnam? Yeah, and whether one likes it or not, and of course it's tough, and it's a reality. The world is as it is, not how it should be or how we would like it to be. And the support for Putin, for good or ill, and I'm neither endorsing nor condemning it, simply saying, has gone up since the beginning of the war, from being in the low 60s to something like 79%. Of course, the methodology, and in wartime, these figures may be, slightly a bit higher, a bit lower. But it's quite clear that Russia's in for the long haul. It has huge military capacity. It has a commitment. The sense, I was also at the time, not long ago, in Murmansk. And it was absolutely clear that, while there is, and laudably so, mostly amongst normal people, no enthusiasm for this war. It's a dreadful war, absolutely dreadful. Yet there was this sense, and again, neither to endorse nor to condemn it, there was this sense that they're in for the long haul. This is the job that has to be done. That we were threatened. That, yes, it is not NATO as such. It was a military power in whatever form, could just be US, UK form, or what have you, is building its forces, that Ukraine, with its virulent Russophobia, de-Russification on our borders, that we faced a security threat. Again, not to endorse it, not to condemn it. We have to understand the logic of what is going on. So therefore, it's quite clear that those who talk about a Russian collapse or retreat, I think, are mistaken. Again, it's just the way things are. And on that basis, then I think that that the Western powers should redouble efforts to find at least an armistice for the time being to alleviate the suffering, and of course the suffering of the Russian people, the Western European people, and globally in famine terms and drought. And of course, within that context, we have climate change. And this war is destroying, it's blowing a huge carbon bomb at the very heart of our climate change commitments. And hence the rather desultory, serious talks that we saw in Egypt in COP27 just recently. So it's basically, like to quote Dmitry Trenin, one of the best and most acute observers, it's going to get worse before it gets worse. But, on the battlefronts, I don't, this is a hunch. I don't think that the so-called, those who argue that the Kiev offensive is going to be pushing the Russian forces out. I think that we can expect a counteroffensive. I don't know how far it'll go. As far as some defensible framework, and then they'll stop. Of course, this could well be accompanied by some sort of maybe military force to cut the supply lines around Lvov from Poland and so on. So, as I said, that is a strategic. But just a final thing on this is that only recently, as we know, just over a month ago, General Surovikin was appointed as the supreme commander. Would you believe it? That until then, effectively, the Russians were fighting 5 separate wars. There was some general loose overall command, but not a general, not like a supremo command as we had in the Second World War with General Eisenhower and in other campaigns where the Allies were clearly all the forces were such like. Now all the fronts are coordinated. Well, so it's absolutely awful in what's going to happen, and it's again that willful blindness of the West in believing, as we know, when people are fighting a war, when you start to believe your own propaganda, that's when you're usually doomed. You're just heading for failure and defeat. But just to say on that final point, no one is going to win this war. This is
exactly
on all sides. Everybody is a loser. Everybody will be defeated. So our job, and I think those of us who want peace and who want the Ukraine to develop as a sovereign, independent, democratic, flourishing, tolerant, peaceful state, want to see this dreadful conflict come to an end. And then let's work within the UN, within those framework, for a more substantive peace order. But that needs 2 other things. It needs a peace settlement within Ukraine, of course, which is absolutely essential, and also that larger European peace settlement, which we didn't get at the end of the First Cold War.
I completely agree with every point Richard has made. I mean, I have little to add, except 2 things. Firstly, my own view is that the Russians, over the last 2 or 3 months, have decided that they're going to wage a long war. I don't personally believe there's going to be vast, sweeping Russian offensives, but I think that they're seeing this as a long haul thing, and I think that the resolve to do it is absolutely there. And I've been reading some of the people who talk about a Ukrainian victory. I don't think they've taken this fact into account at all. And I have to say, I was also reading a whole cluster of articles that have appeared over the last couple of days about, the fall of Putin as being the solution. Well, waiting for the fall of Putin as a solution is not a policy. It's a wish. And you can't, nothing about the situation makes me think that that's going to happen. And anyway, it's a completely reckless way of approaching policy. So that's the first thing to say. The second is prolonging this war, be it as a stalemate or, what General Surovikin was talking about, grinding Ukraine down. Think what it is doing to Ukraine. The cities are without light. There's going to be problems with water. There's problems with food supplies now. It's people who talk about supporting Ukraine in order to achieve victory are losing sight dangerously of what is happening to Ukraine itself, to the appalling suffering that is there. Now, I am somebody who has a particular horror of violence and war, perhaps, but I see pictures coming from the battlefronts every day. It's again a part of the work I do. And they are very disturbing. They are extremely distressing. And is that what we want to see? perpetuated, quite apart from the risks involved in prolonging a war of this nature, the economic risks, the political risks, and of course the risks that the war might escalate in ways that are beyond anybody's control. And I don't want to be too specific about that, because I find that being so can give traction to disturbing things in itself. So absolutely, we need diplomacy. We need to find a solution to this thing. I don't think a solution is impossible, by the way. And anyway, we should try. And it is terrible that no attempt to do this is being made, and that every attempt to argue for it gets shouted down. And I hope and believe that at some point we will see a way to start doing this in a more effective way. And of course, hopefully that will lead to that recalibration of the international system that Richard was talking about.
Well, on that note, we'll wrap it up. And again, thank you again, Richard, for your time, and Alexander, you as well. And yeah, we'll log off. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.